Yeah, so as I mentioned, I've been with the center since the start of '95. One of the first things I did when I got in there, if you recall, I'm kind of predating myself here. The internet really was just sort of coming to be, right? So how do we get information about drought and heighten the visibility and awareness of drought as a hazard up there with floods and tornadoes and hurricanes? Because year in, year out, droughts behave a lot different than these other hazards because they can stick around a very long time. They evolve rather slowly most of the time. And the other events like floods and hurricanes, they come and they're gone pretty quickly. The other thing you don't see with droughts typically is a lot of structural damage or loss of life like you do with tornadoes and floods and hurricanes. So we have some things to overcome that are challenges as far as making people aware of the need to prepare and plan for drought. And really our center is aimed at not only monitoring and early warning, which is why we started this effort with the Drought Monitor back in the late 90s. Myself and a senior scientist with the Climate Prediction Center at the time, he's since retired. And now I don't author the map. I authored the map for 17 years after starting that up, but I don't do that anymore either now in this new position. But we have 3 on my staff, including Brian's done for a very long time, that have taken the reins. But the whole idea here was we were sort of building this around the science before the policy came in and said, hey, this is better than what we were using before, and I'm going to kind of walk you through how that evolved over the years here. Let's jump into it. So if you've been in USDA long enough, and I started with the Soil Conservation Service actually, before the Drought Center, I worked with the Midwest Technical Hub there in Lincoln, Nebraska for a couple years on agroclimatic modeling issues and drought and flooding. And of course, the big story then in '93 was the big floods on Missouri. So I didn't start out in droughts actually. But this was really the tool that was being used by Congress to trigger relief for programs. And if you recall, there probably wasn't much of anything for livestock. So we had the Palmer, which has an inherent 9-month lag to it before these what are called climate divisions start to light up and color. Is typically about a 9-month signature. So these are, when you start getting down here in West Texas, you can put Rhode Island and Connecticut and all those states inside of one of your climate divisions. How do we best represent drought that can vary pretty wildly in the summer due to hitting this thunderstorm activity? It's a challenge, whether you're using satellites, great in situ data, reports from the field. There's going to be some gaps in those networks, no matter what you do, and there's not enough money to throw at it to put a gauge in everyone's backyard. So we have some new tools that are coming online that we'll talk about and Brian will talk about. But what happened was we had this big drought in the Northeast, and I'll come back to this in a little bit. That would prime the pump for us moving towards a different product that took into account more than just one drought indicator. Palmer developed this in the 1950s. He developed it using soils in Iowa and Kansas. It wasn't meant to be applied nationwide necessarily. So how do we go from this to this? So this was our first sort of experimental U.S. Drought Monitor. From the very beginning, we wanted to make sure people understood that local conditions can vary. This is a broad brush national product. So, and you're going to see how this evolved. We had all these red areas, which was, quite frankly, we were doing this off the seat of our pants, and I'll get to that story here as we go. But that's what leads to what we've got today. So you can see the maps really changed in its look and feel. But it didn't always look like that red map I just showed you. If you go back, this is the first one we put together, Doug LeCompte and myself. We actually used Corel Draw, if any of you are familiar with that. So we weren't doing a sophisticated GIS system at that time. And so we were
cutting edge at USDA.
Yeah, exactly. But it was the best we could do, right? So we had all sorts of stuff going on in here, man. I look back on it, it was crazy. We even had forecast information. Plus and minuses would say if it was going to get worse or get better. And then the Climate Prediction Center took out and did their separate forecast product off of that. So in the summer of 1999, when we were doing the experimental maps, I told you about that Palmer map showing the red up here in the Northeast. Well, that's where DC is, right? They said we need something to do a better job of depicting drought than this Palmer drought index because it's got a 9-month inherent lag in it. We need some indicators that are going to show drought sooner than 9 months. So we put this together and sort of started to tweak and refine it as we went through time here. In August, we had they had a White House briefing between the Secretary of Ag and Secretary of Commerce, where they showed this map, and we're showing the drought here and the drought in the West, were the two main droughts they were trying to feature. So we went from experimental the first week of August to fully operational by August 18th, just 3 weeks later. So we had to ramp up very quickly. I quickly threw together about 24, 24 or so, the dirty 24, if you will, experts from the various agencies, not just USDA, but NOAA, USGS, and some of the states, to give us feedback and be our sanity check. But that wasn't enough either, because we have 50 states to cover. That's a lot of ground to cover in 2 days' time, as we make the map Monday, Tuesday, part of Wednesday, and get it released, and then put it on the web on Thursdays. In September here, you could see we had all these scales of red, but it's very hard to tell the difference between the reds. So we quickly knew we needed to go to a different color scheme. But what was always consistent, Brian's going to talk much more specifically about it than I will, but was the ranking percentile that makes up those categories. What's a D1 versus a D4, and I'll let him speak to that. So I don't waste the little time I have to get through this presentation. But this is where we first put in a watch. So D0 isn't a drought category, right? It's abnormally dry now, we call it, but then we call it watch, because this map, if used properly, needs to be used as an early warning system. The problem is people tend to ignore that. It's sticking the head in the sand, classic analogy. It's been dry, but it's going to rain tomorrow, it's going to rain next week, it's going to rain next month. And then before you know it, well, I hope it rains next year. So that's the way droughts work. They sneak up on you. And all those great high sky, blue sky days end up being drought when you look back on it and you didn't get much rain the last 60 days or 90 days. And most people don't complain about it at that time unless you happen to be a rancher or a farmer. That depends on that and doesn't have access to irrigation. All right, so moving on along. In December of 2000 now, so again, still in that early infancy of that, we did a few things to make it more transparent. We put the author's name on the map so someone could contact them if they needed to know how the map was that way. We looked at being more accountable and transparent, which I think was good. The other thing is I hosted the first USDM forum with everyone from individual producers and ranchers to commodity brokers to the ConAgras to state and federal officials, brought them into Lincoln. We had about 75 folks. And we talked about this map and how we can make it better. And so each year since then, we have a forum every spring. Now we alternate between the U.S. and North America. This year it's going to be in Calgary. But the idea here is to get feedback from folks on what they like and what they don't like. And then how can we make it better? So that's what we're doing. The other thing that came out of that first forum were these new objective blends that were a way of automating, putting indicators together. Instead of just looking at 5 maps on a table, can I use data mining? Can I use machine learning to look at the relationship and weight those and put those together? It gives me an educated first guess in a quantitative fashion. So it's not just throwing darts. We're not just drawing lines on the map and guessing. We can use something like that to help guide us. In 2002, we had this big drought in the West, but it also came out here into some of the cattle country, and there's a lot of cattle ranches up in this area. And there had been a lot of dried milk that had expired for human consumption, but was deemed nutritional and of worth to cattle. And so that was the first foray. And I don't know, Scotty, if you were in the room on this one, but that was the first use by USDA.
That was us.
Yeah, to actually trigger something based on the Drought Monitor, but it wasn't formally in the Farm Bill at that point. Okay? But they liked how the program worked, they liked the indicator, they thought it reflected reality better than just using one index like the Palmer Drought Index. 2003, we kind of started to clean up the map some more. Our listserv now, instead of 24 people, we're up to 150, and we took fire off the map because there's always fire season. The droughts exacerbate it, and actually it takes a really nice wet period followed by a drought to dry out that fuel load. So it's complicated. It's hard to separate them sometimes. but we didn't want to step on the fire forecaster's toes. So we kind of, we had some meetings and talked with them, and while they still use this map to sort of look at maybe potential issues, they're looking more an operational standpoint as far as conditions are concerned, whether it be relative humidity, winds, and temperatures and all that good stuff that's not really in the scope of what the Drought Monitor is trying to show. So there's still a partnership there, and we work with the National Interagency Fire Center and others, and in fact there's a big portion of those folks that'll be up at the North American Drought Monitor Forum in Calgary in the first week of May. In August of 2003, this is when it started to change. We moved off of Corel Draw finally after 4 years into the full-blown Arcgis system. We can bring in all these layers digitally now, we can overlay them, and it increased our accuracy, and it increased our resolution and timeliness of delivering the product and analyzing these products in a much more timely fashion. We could look at dozens of indicators very quickly within the GIS system rather than having maps spread out all over the floor in your desktop. So now we fast forward a few years to 2008. This is when it was first written into the trigger within the Farm Bill. And so this is when the Livestock Forage Program picked it up through that language in the Farm Bill, and Scotty's going to talk about that in a little bit, and Ryan, I think, too. But this is really what put it on the map as far as being a trigger. And some other groups use it too. It's grown. Now we have even the Internal Revenue Service uses for tax deferral program for livestock producers. We have the EPA looking at it for potential algae blooms and other things of that nature, so they look at it as well as a hotspot indicator. And now our listserv has grown up to about 225 people as of 2008. That's also the year we first started, because of the GIS, we could start slicing and dicing this down to the county. We could start aggregating to the various geopolitical boundaries the various federal agencies wanted. Whether it's a climate hub now, but we were looking at the regional climate centers, the individual states, and we can generate stats and all sorts of great stuff off of that now that we're in GIS. So this map keeps growing. 2009, our 10th year, 500th map. Between that period of GIS, this is just to give you an example of the variety and breadth of tools, and Brian will talk maybe a little bit more specifically about some of these, but now we can look at satellite, we can look at radar, we can look at putting the drought, that's what these squiggly lines are, that's the drought monitor vectors placed over rasters of other layers. And so we can see at different time periods, whether it's the last week, the last month, the last year, did it rain within a dry area? Was that enough to trigger it out of a drought based on the ranking percentile? Or did it not rain there, and was it bad enough now that we need to increase the intensity? So it's a quick way to do that visually, is to overlay these and bring in dozens of these various products out there. In essence, we don't have to eyeball it anymore. We changed the impact types from ag and hydro, which we thought were a little constricting, especially the A only for ag, because you have all the ecological, environmental sort of indicators that flare up. If you have a 3-month dryness period, it's really warm in the winter, but you don't have a lot of agricultural activity, say in the upper plains, there can still be impacts on exposing ecological areas to severe frost freeze damage, etc., that drought is affecting because of the lack of snow. So we broadened it out to go with an S and an L for short-term and long-term. And roughly, just as a rough guideline, just so you know in the room, short-term drought typically for us on the map is 6 months or less. Long-term is 6 months or longer. That could be up to 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. And in the West, that does matter. When you have huge reservoirs like Lake Mead and Powell, Hoover Dam, it takes a drought of a few years, 2, 3, 4, 5 years even. We need to monitor water supply, groundwater is another big one as well. Our listserv now hits 300 in 2011. So in 2013, we started to centralize it, so all the final production is now at the University of Nebraska, where we're located, so our collaboration partners at USDA and NOAA send all this information to us. We're in the final shapefiles. The web portal, everything is housed outside of the government. And that was actually, I think, a pretty wise move, and one that was actually offered up by the partners just to avoid the red tape and some of the issues that would involve having this on government servers versus having them on a university server. So now we're up to 750 maps in 2013, and we broke out our subsets here for Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. We get about 7 million page views on a typical year. That's pretty common. It can be more or less depending on the year. Last year was actually a very quiet drought year. I think we might have only had 3.5, 4 million page views, and it can go up to 10 or 11 million page views. So this is the final map layout as you see it now. It hasn't changed radically since this time. A few tweaks here and there, but all in all, looks still pretty similar to that. Now we have 361. Brian will talk more about this too. This is kind of how they're distributed. We can do change maps. How is it compared to last week, last month, the water year, the calendar year? That's been a very nice tool that we've used, and there's a whole lot of other data web mapping services available on the website. As of last year, 2 years ago now that we're in 17. So we had 414 participants, and I think it's a little higher than that. And this year we'll be touching on our 1,000th map we'll be rolling out here later this summer. So what are some of the next steps? Well, it's continuing to work with folks like you in the room. We've been working closely now for the last couple of years now that the Climate Hubs have spun up, but we've been working for many years with the regional climate centers, the state climate offices. So John Nielsen Gammon there at Texas A&M, the weather forecast offices, that's always an important thing. University Extension, which is great to be here in the AgriLife facility, and others. So I'm not intentionally trying to leave anybody out, but there's just so many of them. And that's kind of the group that makes up that 425 folks on that listserv. And I think what's unique about this product is that it has the ability to adapt and integrate in new tools, whether it's an evapotranspiration product from satellite, whether it's a state mesonet, whether it's soil moisture model developed by University of Texas or A&M. We can bring those in and put them into those percentiles and compare. I hesitate to say it's apples to apples, but it's definitely fruit cocktail. We're at least comparing fruit to fruit. It's not meat and fruit. But that's one way. They all have different periods of record, so nothing's perfect out there, right? You know, and this product's not perfect either. I'm not trying to say it is. But I believe there's nothing else like it that can integrate in new tools as they come online, and we continue to evolve. Whereas the Palmer is the Palmer, it's an algorithm, it's a set formula that's never going to change. So it cannot adapt to new methods and new tools. And how do we take this automated data and start really breaking it down? And this is where we can work with our friends in USDA and NOAA or ARS to research regional and seasonal differences in how these tools depict drought. Maybe this model for soil moisture does a really good job in the southern plains in the summer, but another model does better in the winter. Well, why apply the same model year-round if we can start teasing out how these tools can respond regionally? So that's what I keep pushing our groups to do. Flash drought, snow drought, forested areas, we're getting a lot of requests from the hubs to work on better indicators for potential tree mortality. And I think that's important too, because that's at a whole different lag and a whole different time scale, kind of like water supply is and groundwater is. There are different kinds of droughts moving in and out of them, and there's lags between those. And then we're going to be rolling out through our work with both NIDIS, which is drought.gov that Brian mentioned, and through USDA with our cooperative agreements with Mark Brosberg's shop. More continued drill down capacity of the tools using GIS. So I think you're going to see some new things rolling out maybe as soon as late this year, but certainly hopefully by next year. Some new ways of looking at this are going to come out. We're starting to work more in that cloud environment. We're even trying to think about expanding into the Virgin Islands. We were right on the precipice of doing it, and then the hurricane hit them. But they were really interested in that, and water's a big thing, and I'll talk in my next talk in a few minutes about impacts, and tourism is a big one. If you don't have water for the cruise ships when they come into port, that's a problem. So you lose all that revenue. So drought has a lot of different faces to it, is what I'm trying to say, depending on what your vocation is. So we want to make a product that can at least have people know in a broad brush sense where the drought is. And what we want to be able to do in the future is then drill down to the specific data at that resolution and scale that you trust. And that we trust as authors in making the map as good as we can. And I think with that, I'm done. So, do you want to take any quick questions?
Yeah,
let's tell the panel, Dave. I mean, we're not on time. We're not behind. So.
I myself have 2 questions. Well, let's ask. So, questions about the history of the Drought Monitor.
I'm just curious, since you've been producing models for so long,
Yeah.
how many years of data, or what's the span that you're using in current forecasts or in current records?
It's all over the board. I think the safest blanket statement is for the satellite data, we're really limited there. Like the newer satellites, maybe 10 to 12 years. The first satellite up there we used for for like NDVI, if you're familiar, if people in the room with the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, that was one of the first products we used in our first 5 indicators back in 98 or 99. That goes back 35 years now. And now most of the model data can go back as early as the 50s even. They'll run the data back, but sometimes there's some magic they have to run on some of those periods of record.
So when you're describing like normal conditions,
Well, when I say that for our ranking percentiles, we're really basing that originally off of the in situ data, which when we first started was really about 1948. And then after that, the climate data were extended back a little further, although there's less stations as you go back, and we have a drought atlas and all that stuff too, and I don't think we're talking about the atlas today. So, but on satellite data, the ranking percentiles are only based on the 12 years. Now, what I will say is even though that's a short period of record, in this last 10 to 15 years, virtually nationwide, we've seen the extreme tails on the wet and the dry side just about everywhere. So it's not like you need 100 years to get a feel for what's really an extreme event anymore, because they're coming fast and furious right now as we look at droughts around the country.
So one of my questions is piggyback on very quickly. So you have 18 years or whatever it is of USDM maps and data, but as you talked about, the process behind the map creation has evolved. So do you have any thoughts on sort of somebody who might be going back, research project, looking at those maps, looking at those data, maybe cautionary?
Yeah, I would say that's a caveat, right? That map that's made today has so much more in it than the map made back in 99, 2000. We only had 5 products at our disposal. I remember sending a survey out to all the agencies, and after 1 month I had 1 Palmer map and a streamflow map mailed to me, not even emailed. It was mailed in hard copy, but 1 was in black and white. That's what I got, so we started, when GIS came along, that stopped all that. Everyone had to get in the game or get out, but you're right, there were fewer products done. And the other thing is I can't go back to the 1950s drought here in Texas. I can't go back to the Dust Bowl years in the 30s and recreate the Drought Monitor, because that system, we just can't go back and take out the expert judgment and the other ways of doing our product. You can't just model that. That's what I'm trying to say. So what we did do are the objective blends to give us our best first guess, so that we're trying to take back. So Mark, we can't take back.
Thank you. Mark, and then Joe.
No, I just, like I said, we've discussed this. Brian, I was giving a talk and somebody asked me a question. It's like, well, why didn't you just leave well enough alone and stick with the Palmer? You might want to reflect on that. It might be interesting to know why we thought the Drought Monitor was needed.
Well, I didn't talk about it here this talk, but in 2012, when Secretary Vilsack took to the streamline, the fast track, the problem with the Palmer, as I mentioned, not only is there a 9-month lag before you might see the drought of the prior summer, the producer might be getting response to that the following calendar year. So there's that lag of response and payment if they had to cull their herd or if they had to bring in forage, whatever the case may be. That wasn't going to help cover that, so it does put some folks at risk. The question is how much risk should they assume versus when does the Palmer help trigger that? And so that was one. So there was that real lag in the program even being applied, that the Drought Monitor immediately said, okay, if you get to D2, boom, we're looking at all these quicker indicators. You're not gonna have to sit on it 9 months and wait for the Palmer to show that. That was probably the main motivation going off the Palmer, was the lag. Big lag.
Jody and then
So with all the data that you've had over the years now, is there such thing as these patterns of droughts as you've looked at all this over the years?
Well, so we have done some initial trend analysis of using data. I mentioned this Drought Risk Atlas, which is a tool I think some of you in the room could use. We don't have time today and a half day to show you that tool, but if you come to the Drought Mitigation Center, it's right on the front page at the bottom. Our main tools are there. It's called the Drought Risk Atlas. You can go into your location and find all the drought indice data back as far as the best stations have it. And many of those, I think, are average length of
65, 67 years.
So that's good data. It's quality control data. We've even cleaned up and put in good estimated data. We leave the raw data there if you don't want to use estimated data. So yeah, it's a great question. So I think as we continue to go forward with some of these other products that are developing their period of record and what do you trust, we've looked at some of the trends. There have been some changes. We just presented those at the Meteorological Service meetings in January in Austin, and we'll be putting those maps up there hopefully later this year. There should be about 500,000 maps available once we start crunching all these now. So the data will all be up through 2017. The trend analysis data will be there. And the bottom line is things, they do ebb and flow. It seems like, even here we were just talking this big drought here back in 10, 11, 12, peaking in 11. And then you're already talking drought here again in 17, 18. So maybe they're coming a little bit sooner in between the periods, but I don't want to say that for sure without looking at those final trend maps.
good question. Start Mark.
At what point, I guess, we live in drought in New Mexico all the time, but it's like, does it become normal?
Good question.
At what point is it just, we're 10 years out, we've been in this situation, that this is just, we're now at a normalcy, and how does this affect that?
Sure. So one thing I do try, especially in the southwest part of the United States, aridity is a permanent feature of the climate, right? Mm-hmm. Droughts are a temporary departure from your norm.
Right.
You're already arid, but a drought is even more arid than arid.
Right.
A desert can have a drought. If you're supposed to get 6 inches and you get 2, maybe that flower doesn't bloom. Maybe that's going to affect that little ecological change there. It's going to affect the forage on the ground if there's grazing of public lands, things of that nature.
Right.
The key is, in climate, we kind of look at things on the decadal scale for shifts in sort of climates, whether it's 30 years or 50 years, and face it, we haven't been around this planet very long, or we haven't been taking climate data very long. But that's always the $1 million question is that a 30-year, that shift to the new normal, which is still arid, but then the droughts are a departure from that new normal. So I never say that you're always in a permanent drought. I would say you're in an arid climate, and the new normal has changed, and therefore drought's going to be a departure from that new normal. Because they're temporary, they come and go, and you might have some great years with monsoon, or you don't get the winter precip during these El Nino, La Nina events. So it's not a simple answer, but typically, I don't know, Dave or Mark or Brian can chime in, but to me, the shifts of a climate to a new regime, I think you got to give it we're so quick oriented on that, but that's not just a 10-year thing. I think you do have to give it at least 30, 50, some would argue maybe 100 years before you would shift and say that, now Nebraska's climate is like central Oklahoma or northeastern New Mexico.
Historically, we have in NRCS, we use the erosion prediction software for wind and water.
Like Russell and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and so one of the factors is the C factor, the climate factor, especially for wind, for example, for wind erosion. We had ISO lines on maps that now it's incorporated into the tool. It's automatically, but we used to manually have those maps, and we still do for some of the regulatory purposes. But it was just curious if you guys had used, since you had worked for NRCS, and I'm sure you were aware of those, but did you use those, or is there some of the same data that kind of went to that model?
Yeah, I did use it actually, I ran the models, and another one called Newhall for soil moisture. But for that one, right, the climate factor, what you did do is update, we were using those 30-year norms. And so every 10 years they update those, and so then we would update that. The question more recently has been, is that too long a period to wait? Should we start up, should we move it more frequently than waiting for a 30-year average period? Should we look at a 15-year average period and update that every 5 years? So that's a debate in the community that hasn't been answered yet, so. All right, so we got time later.
Yeah, we did. So we built an hour of Q&A, so this is
Yeah.
actually part of that hour, so which is great. But before Mark.